Linda, do you want to mute yourself?
Sorry, I thought I had. Hang on.
Excuse me. Right, I might as well. So it's my turn.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this ordinary meeting of the Society of Antiquaries. Number of guests duly introduced by fellows begged leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Minutes.
The minutes of an ordinary meeting of the Society of Antiquaries of London held on Thursday, 6 October 2022 at Burlington House and online. Professor Martin Millett, President, in the chair. The minutes of the anniversary meeting of Thursday, 28th of April 2022 were read and signed. The certificates of candidates for election were laid before the Society in order to be suspended in the usual manner. The President reported on the affiliate member scheme and welcomed affiliates who were present at the meeting. He also reminded fellows that the consultation on changes to Order 3 on the nomination and election of fellows was open, with an EGM to discuss the changes on 20th of October 2022 at 4:15 p.m. The following, being in attendance and having signed the obligation required by the statutes, were duly admitted fellow: Robert Athol, Richard Ragg, Catherine Ingram Smith. The following communication was then laid before the Society. From Gin Craze to Gin Palace, a chapter in the story of gin by Professor Judith Hawley, FSA. Thanks were returned for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would be online only on Thursday, 13th October 2022, then adjourned the meeting. A wine reception followed.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Thank you. Certificates.
4 certificates this evening, and if I could remind fellows, I'm reading a shortened version. You can get more information on the website. Ross Cook, BA, a buildings archaeologist and dendrochronologist, specializing in the interpretation and digital survey of buildings and monuments. Roger Curtis, MSc, a technical research manager with Historic Environment Scotland and commander of the Army Reserve Cultural Property Protection Unit. Susan Ghosh, BA, MA, PhD, a researcher including archive work at the Royal Collection, Dulwich Picture Gallery and the Natural History Museum. Colin Guy Gilbert Hunt, BA, an archaeologist focused on London cemetery archaeology and digital recording techniques. Thank you.
Is it your pleasure that these certificates be suspended in the usual manner? Thank you. I have just one announcement to make, and that's to remind fellows that there is a consultation underway for the amendment of Order 3 concerning the mode of balloting for fellowship, and there will be an EGM next Thursday, the 20th of October at 4:15, where fellows are invited to discuss those proposals from Council. Thank you. That brings us to the main business of this evening's meeting, which is to hear a paper from Dr. Alison Crowther, FSA. Before I introduce Alison, can I just say that we're online. If you wish to ask questions at the end of the lecture, if you could write them into the chat function, we will then pick them up and I will put them to Alison. Alison's lecture this evening is on the archaeology of Westward Austronesian expansion. Alison is joining us from the University of Queensland, where I'm shocked to discover it's 2 a.m. So she's much beyond the call of duty in talking to us this afternoon. At the University of Queensland, she's an Australian Research Council Future Fellow and Associate Professor in Archaeology. She specialises in the analysis of archaeological plant remains, which she uses to study the early agriculture in East Africa, including crop transfers via trans-regional maritime trade. Her ARC Future Fellowship commenced at the start of this year and will build on research that she has led over the last 12 years on early contacts between Southeast Asia and East Africa. She's interested in particular on understanding how these ancient connections transform people's, societies, environments in the Western Indian Ocean. Her presentation this evening includes the results of her own fieldwork and archaeobotanical studies in Madagascar and the Comoros Islands. I'm very much looking forward to hearing this. So over to you, Alison.
Thank you, Martin. And I'll just share my screen with you. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining with me this evening. And it's my pleasure to be presenting to you from, as Martin pointed out, from Brisbane, Australia, where it is 2 a.m. But I'm really excited to join you and to talk about some research that I've been involved in over the last 12 years and is about to sort of embark on its next phase, looking at the archaeology of the Westward Austronesian expansion. So Austronesian languages originate in East Asia and Southeast Asia, and specifically in the region of Taiwan. And what's often not well understood about Austronesian languages is that whilst they're widely dispersed through islands Southeast Asia, and they're the language family spoken by people right through the Pacific Islands as well, from out to Hawaii and through the Solomons out to Hawaii and in Polynesia. They're also spoken by the people today in Madagascar. And Jared Diamond described this in one of his books as this one of the single most astonishing facts of human geography, that people in an African island are speaking languages that originate in Southeast Asia. And it raised many questions about how this Austronesian westward dispersal event occurred and what kind of connections, ancient connections, had led to that. Now, Madagascar is, as I indicated, it's a large island in the Western Indian Ocean. And so it's situated just a few hundred kilometres off the east coast of Africa, where today people along the east coast speak languages that belong to the Bantu group. And that's related to a migration of people through sub-Saharan Africa that began probably about 4,000 years ago. So trying to understand this interesting linguistic scenario where we have Bantu languages spoken on the East Coast, including in the Comoros Islands, which are stepping stone islands between Eastern Africa and Madagascar, and I'll talk a bit about them in my talk today. So how we have this contrast of this linguistic contrast in the Western Indian Ocean has fascinated scholars for more than a century. So this linguistic, I'll just hide that, there we go. This linguistic phenomenon was recognized, there we go, was recognised over a century ago, but it's also reflected in the ethnographic record. There's a whole range of cultural material culture that was brought over to Madagascar through this Austronesian language dispersal, through this migration. Outrigger canoes are probably one of the most visible on the landscape, but there's also social practices, things like bone turning from Adana. There are musical instruments, the tube zither, which is considered to be the musical instrument of Madagascar. It's a bamboo instrument. It originates in East and Southeast Asia. And of course, rice agriculture, another very prominent feature on the landscape. This linguistic and cultural phenomenon was confirmed back in the mid-2000s through genetic work. And that was quite a breakthrough at the time, just looking at haplogroup frequencies. And many studies have gone on to explore this genetic relationship in greater detail. But what it did was show that the people of Madagascar today not only have Southeast Asian ancestry, that they also have a significant African input as well. So we have this admixture event happening between people coming together from continental Africa and Southeast Asia. Some geneticists have predicted that probably occurred maybe as many as 27 generations ago. Where in island Southeast Asia did the Proto-Malagasy people come from? Again, genetics and linguistics have both shed the most light on that. The early work of Otto Dahl for his doctorate in the 1950s identified a really close linguistic link between Malagasy, the language spoken by people of Madagascar, and Manyan, which is spoken in Borneo, in Southeast Borneo. And recent genetic work by Brucato and colleagues has also honed in on that Bornean origin, and in fact shed some more light on the genetic origins of the Malagasy, and shown that it was actually an admixture event between people of Malay origin and those that speak Manyan today. So, and there was also a significant input of genetic input from the Baja communities of Southeast Asia, which are sea nomads. So the current hypothesis is that these sea nomads were probably a significant component of Malay trading, maritime trading societies, and that's what's brought them over to Eastern Africa sometime in the past. So where in Madagascar did they settle? Again, genetics has shed some light on this. A whole genome study done on modern populations from all across Madagascar. You can see the map on the left shows where they've drawn their samples from, has shown some interesting differences between whole genome and maternal and paternal lineages, with Asian ancestry being most significantly represented in populations currently living in the highlands of Madagascar and to the south as well, whereas African ancestry is very much concentrated on the coast, and particularly the northeast coast, which is where Madagascar has its sort of closest outlook, if you like, to the Comoros and then over to the Mozambique coast. So it's perhaps not unexpected. But this, of course, represents a modern landscape, a modern genetic landscape. And we don't have any ancient DNA from this region to really start to tease apart any of these earlier patterns. So what does the archaeology say about the Westward Austronesian expansion? Well, frustratingly enough, as an archaeologist, and as many of my colleagues can agree on, the archaeology has been surprisingly silent on this. Colleagues of mine that have worked alongside Malagasy archaeologists for decades have expressed frustration that, you know, despite doing extensive archaeological research over the continent of the island continent of Madagascar from north to south, they've identified sites that appear to be amongst the earliest on the island. And there's in particular a lot of interest around the first millennium AD or first millennium CE. And those sites I've shown here on this map with those orange dots. So there's a few of them mostly concentrated in the north. None of them have any cultural evidence that really signals a distinctive Indonesian historical route in the early Malagasy, the Proto-Malagasy archaeology. And so there's been no real strong evidence to directly trace the first archaeological, the first inhabitants of Madagascar from archaeology back to the Eastern Indian Ocean. So this has left a whole number of questions unresolved about this Westward Austronesian expansion. When did it happen, for starters? And there's been a huge debate about this. The linguistics and modern genetics are tending to favor quite a late first millennium scenario. But then we have interesting evidence like early banana, which is a Southeast Asian plant, turning up in West Africa and potentially the first millennium BC. And there's debate about that evidence I won't go into here. But whether or not that came through a Madagascan route has been debated. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. What route did they take? Was it a direct transoceanic voyage, which would have been, at the time, it would have been possible with the current maritime technology. And but then others favour Indian Ocean rim voyage, which would have been more favourable in terms of the success of the voyaging, but would have taken a lot longer. And just to reflect on that, some recent studies have shown that if people travelled directly across the Indian Ocean, stopping off in the Maldives, for example, would have increased their chances of getting to Madagascar. How often did people travel across the Indian Ocean? Were these sustained connections? Or was it a single one-off accident? And some early genetic work done by Murray Cox and colleagues seemed to suggest that it was perhaps just a one-off accident. There's a small population arrived in Madagascar, and that's led to the contemporary scenario. Whereas others have argued, no, it's more likely it was part of sustained maritime trade. They've linked it back to the Srivijaya trading empire. It was a big maritime empire that was operating in the Malay region at the time frame that we're talking about in the late first millennium CE. And there's possibilities that it was linked then into slave trade and raiding in Eastern Africa. So perhaps Madagascar was set up as sort of a slave trading node on that network. Where in the Western Indian Ocean did they settle? Obviously, Madagascar is a key location, but did they also move on to the East African coast? Did they settle on other islands like the Comoros? And the questions that I'm ultimately most interested in looking at are, what was the process of interaction and admixture between the peoples of Eastern Africa of Bantu speaking origin and these people coming across the Indian Ocean from Southeast Asia with distinct ancestries, distinct cultures, distinct languages? When did that interaction take place, and how did it unfold and essentially lead to the genesis of new cultures in the Western Indian Ocean? One way that I'm interested in exploring this question is through food and through plants. And if we look at Madagascar today and the main food crops that are produced on the island, we can start to see some layering of the history of cuisines and crop introductions on the island. Obviously, some of these today are very recent introductions from the New World, like maize and cassava. But we've got, a strong sorghum industry in the south of Madagascar. Sorghum is a crop of African origin. It was probably domesticated somewhere in the sort of Sudanese region of Eastern Africa. And then we've got rice, which is the main crop in the highlands and up into the north, particularly along that east coast of Madagascar, which is very wet, very forested. And rice in this case is we're referring to Asian rice, not African rice. So this provides some hints about the plant foods that were perhaps brought to Madagascar through this Southeast Asian migration. And then there are other historical and linguistic hints that point to the former importance of other crops that have Southeast Asian origins. And these are often referred to as Murdoch's food kit or Murdoch's tropical food kit, after the gentleman who discussed them at length in terms of their relationship in Africa. And these are crops like yam, taro, and banana. And if we look not only just at how the fact that they're not significantly important in agriculture in Madagascar today, but they're grown everywhere. They're often in people's gardens. They're in a lot of cases just growing feral. As this picture here shows, it's just a wild, well, not wild, but a sort of a feral stand of taro just on the edge of a village. But they're often very important in agricultural rituals and other social practices. So yams are often gifted at royal inaugurations in Madagascar. It's a very prestigious food item, and that links back to the role of yam in similar rituals in Melanesia. And taro in Madagascar, even today, is often planted in rice paddies at the start of the season. Is this another practice that was brought by the first colonists? And I'll talk a little bit about banana in a minute as well, but there are seedy bananas that occur on the northeast coast of Madagascar. And then how does, we can sort of dig a little bit deeper into this as well with looking at the rice, Asian rice cultivation today. And in the northwest coast and highlands of Madagascar, rice tends to be irrigated, it's paddy rice. And the production technologies that are used traditionally are really strongly linked to Indian practices, and there's a little bit of Malay mixed in as well. And the genetics of the traditional rice varieties in that part of Madagascar are very strongly linked to the indica rice varieties that come originally from India. But at the time of that we're expecting Madagascar to be colonized, they were already in Southeast Asia as well. But then on the east coast, we have a more slash and burn type of agriculture with hill rice, which some people have suggested might have been the first rice to be introduced to Madagascar. And the rice production technologies tend to be more Malayan, and there's lots of strong genetic links to japonica varieties, which were coming through originally from Southeast Asia. So how does that map onto our first millennium sites, the archaeological sites that we're probably most interested in exploring? Well, there's a very clear connection to that early Malayan rice history there. So certainly something of importance to think about. So let's have a look at these crop transfers in a bit more detail. So I've mentioned Murdoch's tropical trio. So we've got banana, taro, and yam. And then rice as well, japonica rice, which whilst it wasn't domesticated in Southeast Asia, it was domesticated in China and East Asia. It was becoming very embedded in Southeast Asia at this time. And there's some increasing archaeobotanical evidence to support that. And it was sort of layered on top of this this deeper root of vegiculture around banana, taro, and yam. And so Southeast Asia is a really important area of domestication, as is neighboring Papua New Guinea and Melanesia. Domestication and cultivation of these kinds of plants. You've got various cultivars of banana, including wild banana in this region. And what's interesting then is that I mentioned this early find of banana in West Africa, and this comes from an archaeological site in Cameroon. And in this particular, in West Africa, in the rainforest zone of West Africa and Cameroon and neighboring countries, plantain is the main banana produced today. And so the argument has been that there's maybe this early introduction of AAB cultivars into West Africa. Whether or not it's through an East African route or an alternative route through the north is still debated. I mentioned as well that there's wild banana on Madagascar. It's also found on the island of Pemba, which is where we've done research. So we've actually collected samples of this seedy banana. You can see an example here. It still has big seeds. It's almost inedible. It's basically a monkey food in these islands now. We've collected samples. We've actually had them genetically tested, and the two populations in Pemba and Madagascar are genetically linked. They seem to come from the same origin, but we have no idea how they got there or when they got there. They could be very recent for all we know. And then there's that interesting, the interesting cultivation and hybridization patterns of rice in Madagascar. There's also zones of admixture between different coconut varieties in this region as well. So it's quite interesting in terms of the layering of food crops moving into the region. But we've also got crops coming in from India. Indian rice, I've mentioned. as well as various legumes like horse gram and mung bean. And the big question for us is, well, how did they get to Africa? Did they come through one route? Did they come through multiple introductions? So there's question marks all over this diagram, really, because we don't really have a clear indication of when a lot of these crops arrived and how. And that's part of what I'm trying to disentangle with my research as an archaeobotanist, but also then combining that with the broader archaeological evidence that we're examining from our sites. So the situation in Eastern Africa, when I began this research back in the end of 2009, 2010, was that there hadn't been a lot of archaeobotanical research done in this region at all. Archaeobotanically, on a global scale, Africa, I would say, is very neglected, and compared to Europe and other regions. But Eastern Africa in particular was very depauperate on archaeobotanical evidence. People simply weren't doing the systematic flotation to collect this data. Aside from a few important studies, work done by Sarah Walsh on Pemba, I have to point out, and also some pioneering work that was done by my very close friend and collaborator, Henry Wright, back in the 80s, where he actually did flotation at some of his sites in the Comoros and actually provided us with some of the foundational research that I then went and built on. So over the last 10 or 12 years, I think, now we've been systematically going out to sites in Eastern Africa doing archaeology, and I've been doing all of the archaeobotany for that. And we've looked at, I think, about 23 sites now. I'm still plowing my way through the botanicals because they do take time. But a few years ago, we published our first real synthesis of this data. And that's what really first led us to understand the very distinct botanical signatures that we were seeing in the region, particularly contrasting the East African coast and Madagascar and the Comoros. So the first trend that we picked up on was the fact that, unsurprisingly, on the East African coast, so we've got sites including caves and rock shelters, we've got Iron Age villages on the coast of Kenya, we've got trading sites on Zanzibar, port sites as well, right down through the Mafia archipelago, and some work also done by Matthew Palawich in southern Tanzania. All of the archaeobotany from these sites shows a real strong preference for African crops. So these are crops like sorghum, pearl millet, finger millet, baobab, and cowpea. And there's at some sites, it's almost exclusively African crops. And I do acknowledge that sometimes the number of finds that we have are not high. The preservation can be very hit and miss in this part of Africa. It's very tropical. At sites where we do tend to pick up a few Asian crops, they tend to be trading ports. So Unguja Uku, if you can see my mouse here, Unguja Uku on Zanzibar has some rice grains coming in, as does Tumbe on Pemba. And these are really important trading sites. Then we can contrast that with the botanical signatures that we're seeing in the Comoros and Madagascar. And here we're seeing a much stronger preference for Asian crops. Asian rice, you can see a lovely assemblage that we have here from the site of Sima in the Comoros. Mung bean, which is, again, coming in from Southeast Asia, and cotton as well. And with cotton, it's obviously not a food crop, but it's an important fiber crop, and it produces quite robust remains, these little caps called funicular seed caps that sort of located under the outer tester layer of the seed of cotton, and they're quite robust. So we find them quite a lot, particularly in our sites in northern Madagascar. So straight up, we can sort of see this very distinct culinary pattern forming. And if we dig a little bit deeper into the morphometrics of our rice, I've talked about the fact that there's Japonica rice coming probably, of Southeast Asian, East Asian origin, as well as Indica rice of Indian origin. And we know that they're both introduced into Madagascar. They hybridize, they form new varieties that are grown there today. We can do morphometrics on just the length and width of rice grains to try and tease those two cultivars apart, or the subspecies apart. If you guys pay attention to the rice that you consume at dinner. If you're eating sushi, you'll notice the rice grains are often very short and fat. Whereas if you're eating basmati rice, perhaps with your Indian curry, you'll notice the rice grains are really long and thin. They're quite slender. So we can use those morphometrics on our ancient rice grains as well. And looking at our best sample of rice, which comes from Sima here in the Comoros, we had nearly 500 rice grains. We actually have a mixed population. We've got what's probably Japonica, what's probably Indica, and a bit of a mix in the middle that we can't disentangle. So we're already seeing, as early as the late first millennium, both of these rice varieties coming into this region. So do we have a culinary frontier emerging in Eastern Africa? Is there any other evidence of this frontier? Well, we can look a little bit at the other archaeological evidence. One thing that stood out to us is the fact that along the East African coast exclusively, in the archaeological record, they're not well preserved, but at a few sites, certainly, we find these mofa. It's a Swahili word for a bread, basically. So these ovens that are thought to be for baking millet bread. That's never actually been directly tested through residue work. We've collected samples for this, and hopefully in the next few years, we'll get that work done. But these are exclusively found on the East African coast. It's a culinary tradition that doesn't move into the Comoros or Madagascar. But we can contrast that with chlorite schist vessels. So chlorite schist, it's a soapstone, and this is carved into platters and vessels in northern Madagascar from around the 8th century. So in those earliest sites that we know of. And they move into the Comoros, and then later, around the 11th century, they start turning up on the East African coast. And it happens to coincide with when, archaeobotanically, we actually see a bit of a shift to rice on the East African coast. And on Pemba in particular, it was a pattern that Sarah Walshaw picked up in her research. So we're wondering again, is chlorite schist perhaps a cultural marker for rice? And it's interesting because these platters are very large and open, and they're perfect for communal feasting, and rice is often associated with these kinds of communal food events, if you like. So perhaps there is a link there to rice. And again, we've collected samples for residue work that we're hoping that we can initiate soon. So let's think back to this, this culinary frontier and how else we can explore it. And there's a couple of gaps that really stood out to us, and questions that arose from this when we reached the end of this sort of first phase of our research. And the first one was that we had this gap in Madagascar of data from our first millennium site. So on my map here, we've got a site called Ampasima Havelina. I'll talk about it more in a minute, but you can see we didn't have any botanicals from that site, at least no crop remains. I'd looked at material from Lakatoni Anza, which is a cave site in northern Madagascar. It's quite a controversial site because it's been argued that there's evidence of occupation at that site that goes back 4,000 years, that there might have been sort of like a hunter-gatherer occupation of Madagascar that's quite early. That's debated, but regardless, there is a late first millennium occupation at the top of that site. I found 2 cotton seeds. And then we have Mahilica, where we have our best evidence in Madagascar, but Mahilica's a little bit later. It really doesn't kick off until the beginning of the second millennium, right at the end of the first millennium, beginning of the second millennium. And it's a big trading port. You can see it's perfectly positioned to trade over to the Comoros and then to the East African coast. So here we are with our first millennium sites. And I mentioned we went to Ampasima Havelina in 2013, and we were building on work that had been done previously by Henry Wright and Bob Dewar there. And we spent a month excavating at this site. Just a quick picture to show you. It's just it's right near Vuma, which is a contemporary town on northeast Madagascan coast. And the site itself is just kind of situated just on this slightly raised piece of land that was probably looking out onto a bit of a swampy, almost the edge of what might have potentially been an older water system. Would have been perfect as a rice paddy location. So Bob and Henry excavated there back in the 1990s. We went back, or early 2000s, I should say, and we went back in 2013. And you can see in the excavation, it's a very shallow site. You've got this very rich rice paddy type sediment on top, but then you come down on this sort of lighter coloured soil, and it's full of our archaeological evidence of this first millennium occupation. Unfortunately, though, it didn't reveal any botanicals for us. We found lots of sedge tubers and a lot of Terebralia shells, and wild fauna. So it kind of was a pattern that indicates maybe certainly an early colonization site where they're not really cultivating yet, but they're just exploiting wild fauna and flora as they're settling there. And as I said, these early first millennium sites, they're ceramic sites, and the pottery is incredibly crude, to be honest. It's not very well made. You can see it's full of big chunks of calcareous temper, shell temper. When you compare that, when you think about traditions potentially coming in either from Southeast Asia or even Africa, where pottery is very well made at this point, you sort of do get the impression of people trying to work out for the first time how to make pottery, and they've probably seen it done, but have never really had to do it themselves. And this is very similar across a lot of these early first millennium sites in Madagascar. So we really wanted to fill our first millennium gap, and unfortunately, a lot of the sites in northeast Madagascar have been destroyed. Urudu, for example, on the northeast coast there, it was destroyed by a cyclone many years ago. The Sundrakatsi sites that Henry Wright had recorded back in the 80s, they're no longer able to be located, and no one's really gone back looking for them for decades anyway. So we turned our attention to a site called Nusimunga, which is on an island called Nusimunga. It's in the Bay of Anton Gilles, which it's a bit hard to see on my map here, but this is actually a bay, quite a large bay here, just off the coast, the town of Marinsetra. And so Nusimunga Bay is this beautifully forested island. It's a reserve today. It's actually a primate reserve. So I've got a picture there of some of our lemur friends. And so it's quite well protected as part of the Mashuala Nature Reserve. And people don't live on the island today. There's a caretaker there. There's a little research station. A lot of primatologists go there to study the primates. But it's also obviously the perfect location for us to do archaeology. It only has one suitable beach for basically landing watercraft here at Bay Memoria. And Henry Wright had first recorded this site back in the 80s. He spent a couple of days on the island. He dug a latrine for the primatologists that were working there and found archaeology. And he got a one radiocarbon date, discovered that it was first millennium. He had was unable to do any other reconnaissance work. Before that, Pierre Varan had gone there in the 1960s, and he'd also found archaeology. So Henry had looked at the northern end of the bay, and Pierre Varan had worked at the southern end. And so they'd found settlements at both ends. And we thought this might be a good contender for early rice agriculture because there was evidence that perhaps charcoal, it's quite hilly, and it looked like there had been evidence of deforestation and charcoal erosion that was coming into the archaeological deposits. So we went to the island in 2015. We had National Geographic funding. And look, you know, every field season I think that I've been on has had some element of adventure to it, but this particular field season really was sort of probably one of the most memorable, let's put it that way. And there is a saying that the journey is more fun than the destination. Well, we turned up in Madagascar. We had a month for our field season, and unfortunately it happened to coincide with when Air Madagascar was having a strike. So rather than taking the direct route and flying from Tana directly to Marinsetra, we could be there in an hour, jump on a boat and be at Nusimunga Bay. Instead, unfortunately, after waiting about a week to see if the strike resolved itself, and there was no sign of the negotiations with the Air Madagascar crew and the company reaching any resolution, we had to make the decision to go by road. And look, when you plug it into Google Maps, it says, sure, take Route Nationale 5 and then Route Nationale 2 along the coast, and you'll be in Mare Setra in 16 hours. But what Google Maps doesn't take into account, and we were well aware of this, is that it's an unsealed road north of Taormina, and it involves multiple river crossings. It's widely considered to be one of the worst roads in the world, and it's even featured on what were those guys called? Top Gear have even done episodes on this road. And look, I can't help but share some photos to sort of show you. It took us 5 days to do this journey. It was 5 grueling days. On our worst days, I think in 12 hours, we managed to get 100 kilometers. We got bogged. We had to take an interesting range of ferries to cross various rivers. Some were mechanical, some were very simple bamboo ferries that could barely fit our Land Cruiser. But it was quite a spectacular journey. One of my favorite photographs there on the left, there's Victor, our driver, on our troopy coming across this particular river, basically being dragged by a rope on a pontoon of wooden planks. And you can see that, the quality of some of the bridges we had to cross. So there was a lot of getting out of the car and walking whilst Victor took responsibility for taking some of these more adventurous routes. But it also gave us the opportunity that we wouldn't have had if we'd flown, to really get an appreciation for the East Coast landscape. And it's an incredibly rugged landscape. It would have been really treacherous navigating this landscape in outrigger canoes in the past. And most people today tend to do the route overland. But the other thing too is we got to see those transported landscapes in person, the rice paddies, and you can see there's a zebu cow here, which is an Indian introduction. I showed this photo earlier of the banana and taro just on the edge of this little village that we passed through. But we eventually made it to Mare Setra, and our destination, Nusi Bay, it's visible from the mainland, you can see here. So here we are at Bay Memoria. We've got the 2 sites that Henry and Pierre had recorded. And we only had 5 days on the island because we still had to do our drive home. And we only had a month for this fieldwork. We'd already lost so much time. So we really just put our quickest plan into action. Here we are at the research facility that's set up for the primatologist. And the site that Henry had discovered when he dug his latrine is just actually in this copse of trees here off to the left. And you can see the beach right here, just off to the right. So we put in 2 test pits, one in site 2 and one in site 1 at the other end of the bay. We dug as fast as we could. We floated like mad. We managed to float hundreds of litres from the site to try and really get up those botanical counts. And here's a photo of Henry hard at work. There's no electricity on the island. Everything was done in daylight hours or by lamp at night. It was wet. It was constantly damp. It was, some very challenging fieldwork conditions. And what did we find at Nusi Bay? Well, the excavations were really small, obviously, and we're hoping to go back with my current funding. But we did find trade wares, ceramics that certainly put us in that late first millennium timeframe. So we could sort of breathe a sigh of relief that we were digging in the right place. We found a tiny fragment of glaze from turquoise glazed-ware ceramics. They're of Persian Gulf origin, and they're very widespread across the trading areas of Eastern Africa at this time. There was some abrasive white glaze as well. We also found a really lovely assemblage of glass beads, and there were about 44 that we found in our excavations, and we sent those to Marilee Wood and Lord de Saubieu to analyse. Marilee does the classifications of the morphologies, the typology, and Laura, who's at the Field Museum, she does the elemental analysis on these beads. And Laura and Marilee have really amassed a huge database of bead types across Eastern Africa. We've worked closely with them on a lot of our sites, and they've worked right down through along the coast to Mozambique, to trading ports like Chibouan. And we're quite excited because when we finally got results from them, which was actually quite recent, we haven't published this, they said these are beads unlike any we've found before in the Western Indian Ocean. And chemically, glass beads in Eastern Africa, they all tend to come from South Asia, but there are different recipes that they use to make the beads, and they can use elemental analysis to tease those recipes apart and try and work out where are the beads coming from, but maybe are they coming through different trade routes? Do different places have different partnerships with different traders? And our Nusi Mangabe beads, I've circled them here. When we look at one types, beads that are high or mineral soda high alumina beads, they form a distinct group that they've identified as being a completely new type of mineral soda high alumina beads in the Western Indian Ocean. They actually don't know where these come from, but they suspect probably South Asia. And then there's this other major bead type that is the plant soda ash beads. And these are found a lot at the site of Nguja Ku on Zanzibar that I'd mentioned earlier. It's a site we'd worked at for many years. And our analyses of beads there had shown them to be mainly of this particular type. And they're also very common in Southern Africa. They're very widespread in Southern Africa. But the Nusi Mangabe beads are, again, a new type of this plant soda ash recipe. And again, never been before identified in the Indian Ocean. So where they come from, we don't yet know. So this is kind of exciting because it's showing that the people on Nusi Mangabe had perhaps different trade connections to those at the other sites that we've collected information from. The other thing that we found a lot of at Nusi Mangabe, or a little bit, I should say, but in this particular instance, a very large chunk, is rock crystal. This is about a 15 centimetre chunk. It was found right at the bottom of one of our pits. Now, rock crystal is naturally occurring in northeast Madagascar. There's a lot of outcrops of it. You can see Nusi Mangabe here on the map, right down the coast. And we everywhere we stopped along the way, we would see it just littered on the road. Around Vuoma as well, and Ampasima Havelina, our other site, is located up here near Vuoma. So rock crystal was a really important trade item, and it shows up very early on in the Comoros as well. And we've sort of been thinking about, well, could there have actually been, like, why are they moving all this rock crystal around? Why are they trading it? And we're wondering, perhaps, could East Africa be a source of the Fatimid rock crystal that was carved very famously in the late first millennium, early second millennium, into beautiful objects? This was part of the Fatimid dynasties in Egypt. And, the quality of the rock crystal that we see in Madagascar is probably not quite good enough for it, but we're just trying to understand why there is so much trade in this rock crystal. And importantly, the botanicals. Now, unfortunately, despite all of our flotation, the archaeobotany at Nusi Mangabe was not fantastic. The site, it's very wet, it's very tropical, it's the preservation just isn't great. But we did find rice, a couple of grains. They're not well preserved. We haven't been able to date them for that reason. But there's also a lot of canarium. There's a wild canarium that occurs on Nusi Mangabe. And we find charred canarium endocarp all through that sequence. We've even found what's probably a nut-cracking stone. So we've been able to get radiocarbon dates on our canarium. And but again, canarium is a tropical nut, if you like. It's really high in good. It's a good source of fats and is widely eaten through the tropics of the world, if you like. And it's found from Southeast Asia. It's moved out into the Pacific Islands by people, but it occurs naturally here. So again, this might have been a food source that they readily recognized when they arrived in this region, because they sort of brought that knowledge with them from Southeast Asia. Our radiocarbon dates, we're waiting on more that we've submitted, but our first round of dates were okay from Nusi Mangabe. We've certainly got dates that are pushing us into that late first millennium timeframe, but we've also got a strong signal coming in a little bit later as well. So we're hoping that our new dates will help us clarify this sequence and put our archaeology into context. But this is exciting because we still have, potentially here that first millennium gap in our rice archaeobotany. So our second question, I'm conscious of time, and I've got a few more slides to finish, but not many. The second question that we're really interested in was, were the Comoros part of the Westward Austronesian expansion? The focus until now had obviously been on Madagascar, but we've got these little stepping stone islands here that are perfectly placed to allow people to move between East Africa and Madagascar. And the archaeobotany was telling us in the earliest sites in the Comoros, they're, culinarily, they're sort of part of this proto-Malagasy rice culture. And the Comoros, in contrast to Madagascar, the linguistic and genetic evidence for Southeast Asian connections in the Comoros are not quite as strong as they are in Madagascar. There's not really a clear Southeast Asian signal. The people in the Comoros today speak a Bantu language. It's closely related to Sabaki, which is spoken on the northeast coast of Kenya. And African ancestry is very, very dominant. There is a very minor Southeast Asian signal coming in. It's less than 10%, but we also know that historically there's a lot of slave raiding going on. Some islands in the Comoros, it's recorded, were almost depopulated by slave raiding. So we don't know how much of that signal is actually coming in more recently from contact with Madagascar. So here we are in the Comoros. There's actually 4 islands in the Comoros archipelago. My beautiful color map here actually cuts off Mayotte, which is the 4th island. These 3 islands, Grand Comore, Mohele, and Anjouan, are today part of the Union of the Comoros, whereas Mayotte is still a French territory. And the first evidence of human occupation of the Comoros, it dates in this exact time frame, this late 1st millennium time frame that we're dealing with. And these sites are called Dambeni phase, they're 8th to 10th century, and they were identified largely through small-scale excavation and reconnaissance work by Pierre Véran and Henry Wright in the 60s through to the 1990s. And there's not many Dambeni phase sites. There's only a couple known on Grand Comore, one that we know of on Anjouan called Sima. There's a couple on Mohele, and there's one important one called Dambeni, and I've shown that up here on this little inset that's found on Mayotte. And these sites, as you'll see, are rapidly being lost to climate change. Sea level rise is eroding these sites. Henry this is Membeni on Grand Comore, where we went and did work in 2016. And Henry had recorded Membeni back in the 1980s. And he estimates that it was more than half of the site's been lost to erosion. And what's quite tragic about that is that so you can see here this erosional surface. So at high tide, the water actually comes up and washes over the site. And it's basically just stripping away the surface of the archaeology, as well as eroding that terrace back, that beach terrace. And it's revealing this Dambeni phase midden, which is kind of great for archaeology in some respects, because we don't have to dig through all the overlying occupation to get to the early stuff. So we did some excavations here to recover the botanicals and the fauna. We've got trade goods again from the Gulf region, sustaining Islamic or turquoise glazewares here. We've got Chinese ceramics from known as Changsha, and these are just examples of complete vessels to show you what these would have looked like. And these are from the Belatung wreck, which is a famous wreck in Indonesia that was probably bringing wares potentially to the Western Indian Ocean. But the real tragedy here is that there's actually quite a large cemetery at Membeni. And these human remains are essentially eroding out into the ocean. And the local community at Membeni are really concerned about this. The archaeological community are concerned. So we went in and did a salvage excavation in 2016. There's our team. And it allowed us to, we salvaged 10 burials from the foreshore. Most of them were reburied on site after we had recorded and analysed them. And we're able to sample some of them for various analyses, including ancient DNA analysis. And we're waiting on the finalisation of those results, but we're really excited. Maybe we can find genetic evidence of this early Southeast Asian African admixture, and that would really help cement our understanding of those Southeast Asian connections. But it also allowed us to do work on things like dietary isotopes, and our analyses of the bone collagen from these individuals is showing that they certainly have a diet that's high in marine protein, but the tooth enamel, which gives us more of a whole diet signal, it's showing that, that the diet was predominantly C3, which is interesting because rice is a C3 food, but there's a small signal of C4 plants coming in as well, which would probably be our African millets and marine foods. So the dietary isotopes are really confirming the archaeobotany that I've been doing. We also attempted to look at dental calculus, the microfossils in the plaque that had formed on the teeth of some of these individuals were unfortunately not well preserved. There were only a couple of starch granules, which come from carbohydrate-rich plants. So cereals like rice and millets are full of starch. Bananas full of starch, as is taro and yam, but the preservation was not fantastic. And we also looked at the proteomics to see if we could pick up a protein signal. And again, there was just really poor preservation. But this does, the dietary isotopes in particular is backing up the archaeobotany, and I'd found pearl millet, rice, and coconut shell as well in the middens at Membeni. And just quickly, the other site that I want to touch on is a site called Sima on Anjouan. And it's the only Dembeni phase site known on Anjouan. It was, again, recorded back in the 80s by Henry Wright and earlier in the 60s by Pierre Veran. And it's actually not located on the coast, but it's actually located on this ridge that kind of rises up from the coastline on the western coast of Anjouan. And if you look at this image, it's showing that there's actually, it's actually one of the few places on Anjouan where there's a break in the fringing reef. So it would have actually been the ideal landing place for vessels coming in. And back in the 80s, Henry, and here's Henry in 2013, but in the 80s, after they had put this road through, he was doing reconnaissance on the island. He drove past this cutting and he saw out of the vehicle that it was full of these pits that were full of archaeology. He jumped out of the car, recorded the section, he took some samples, he did flotation, and that was what gave us that first really strong rice signal from the site. Our team returned in 2013. We did another cleanup of the section. We collected more samples so that we could get more dates on, more botany. And then with National Geographic funding, we went back in 2019. And to our horror, we discovered that the local landowner had heard rumours of diamonds on the site, and we suspect he was thinking of rock crystal. And at nighttime, under the cover of darkness, he and friends had been going in and digging out the archaeological deposits behind the site. And they actually, this is the gentleman here. We actually brought him on to help us with the archaeology. We did sort of outreach work with him, if you like, to sort of help him understand the importance of not digging up archaeological deposits, the fact that once things are destroyed, once the context is destroyed, they have no significance. And he realized that his diamonds were not diamonds, they were rock crystal. But you can see the extent of the damage. It was about 10 meters by 10 meters, and they dug down 3 or 4 meters and destroying all of these deposits. So we were quite shattered. They just piled up all the ceramics and shell. It was all nicely laid out in groups, mind you. They'd grouped all the pottery together. We think that they'd seen potentially what our team had done earlier. We cleaned up the site. We actually found that there was still intact stratified Dembeni phase pits. And you can see this is the same pit from 2 angles. You can see it this lovely stratified deposit. And there was actually another one in this section here. So we excavated that out. Here's our team working on those materials. And again, we've got lots of imported ceramics from the 8th to 10th century. We've got a beautiful assemblage of glass and carnelian beads, as well as these glass vessels, which we've never found anything like these on the East African coast. They're tiny, they're gorgeous. They probably may have perfumes or something in them. So we're now embarking on our next phase of research to do all the elemental analysis on these, some residue analysis. But the other thing that was exciting about SEMA was that it gave us the first opportunity to get up close and personal with Dembeni phase pottery. We got a really rich assemblage. And this Dembeni phase pottery had been described quite a lot by archaeologists. They'd referred to these Arca shell impressions and these dentate impressions. And you can see them up close here. And for me, I'd done my PhD actually on archaeobotany in the Pacific Islands, looking at lapida sites. And I knew very well that dentate stamping is a really important part of that lapida. It's an Austronesian linked culture. And but lapida is way too early for our sites in the Comoros. Like, we just can't draw that kind of comparison. But recently there have been findings in Southeast Asia of sites with dentate stamp pottery that are more in the time frame of our connections to East Africa. And this site was only published in 2019. It was the same year we were in the Comoros. So this is really exciting. And you'll note that it comes from around Sulawesi, not far from Borneo. And there's also been reports, we have red slipped graphited wares in the Comoros. These are locally produced pots. They get traded over to East African, the mainland in East Africa, but they're made in the Comoros. And again, we know that there's this really important tradition of red slipping pottery in island Southeast Asia. It's got deep roots there. And, you know, whilst we can't necessarily draw direct connections, there's all these tantalizing links that are really starting to appear to us. And of course, the site was full of rock crystal. Here is Borhan. He is one of the few archaeologists from the Comoros with a doctorate, and he was with us for this excavation. So here he is with his diamonds with the rock crystal. I think I'm almost at my last slides. I know I'm right on time. Our radiocarbon dates for these sites, well, our Membeni Midden and our Sema Midden are smack bang on that 8th to 10th century time frame for colonization. Our Membeni burials, however, are a little bit later. They're probably about 200 years after people first arrived in the Comoros. So when we start to piece together that evidence, we can think about them as being several generations after the first colonists, which in many respects might actually be, you know, quite interesting when we get our genetic results. What are we doing next? Well, our next big questions are coming back to what was that process of cultural interaction and population admixture, and you know, what were the outcomes of this Westward Austronesian expansion? What were the cultural outcomes, the biological outcomes, but also the environmental outcomes? What was the impact of colonization on these islands? And can we look at how the introduction of agriculture, and I haven't talked about the animal domesticates, but goats and sheep were brought in, cattle. So there's all this layering of environmental change that occurs as well. And that's essentially what we're hoping to do with the next phase of my research. So we've got 4 years of funding. We'll be looking at migration and mobility, looking at, you know, this sort of climb, this geographical climb between the East African coast through the Comoros to Madagascar. We'll do some strontium isotopes on these individuals. We'll look at exchange in this region, do more work on sourcing our beads and glass. Obviously, subsistence and consumption is important, and we've got a lot more archaeobotany to do, particularly looking for those vegicultural crops, which are notoriously hard to find. And then those questions around island colonization and impacts. And there are many directions we can take this in. I won't take up any more of your time, but I just wanted to acknowledge my funding sources, the Australian Research Council, National Geographic, the ERC and UQ, my wonderful team of collaborators, and the various institutions that have supported our work in East Africa, Madagascar National Parks, the University of Antananarivo, CNDRS in the Comoros, and the Max Planck, where a lot of this work has been conducted collaboratively. And that ends my presentation. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much indeed, Alison. That was absolutely fascinating talk. And it's really very pleasing to me to see a project that sort of starts from the archaeobotany in a sense and builds out into other directions in archaeology rather than having the archaeobotany as a sort of bolt on at the end. So fantastic lecture. Thank you very much, Alison.
Thank you.
If I could take sort of chair's privilege in asking the first question. This issue of whether you're coming directly across the Indian Ocean or around the top, so to speak, ties in with the trade winds and so forth. Is it relatively easy to go across the middle? Because I'm familiar with the sort of northern route where sort of links with South Asia are very much determined by the trade winds. What's the determinants of the middle route, if I can put it that way?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, if you take the northern route and you go around the Indian Ocean rim, you've obviously got lots of stopovers that you can make along the way, but you are very much at the mercy of the trade winds.
Yeah.
And the return journey from Southeast Asia to East Africa would have actually taken quite some time, because you would, once you get to one end, you have to wait for the winds to change so you can go back the other way. So it would have been quite a long route, certainly at least I think a year is what they say. Whereas if you go directly across the Indian Ocean, and we call that the southern route sometimes, I actually took these slides out because I knew I'd go over time if I included them. It's actually been tested through a few sort of Thor-Heyerdahl-esque Kon-Tiki style replica vessels, where people have made like replicas of the Borobudur ship, which is a famous ship represented in carvings in Indonesia, and they've actually sailed these vessels across the Indian Ocean. And they've actually found that it's very possible to do very quickly within a month, and if you time it right. And in one of the quotes that I had from that study is, we basically like sort of I can't remember the words, but yeah, we sort of sailed rapidly across the Indian Ocean. There was, but there was some simulations done by Scott Fitzpatrick and I think it's Richard Callahan, that they worked out, they modeled all of the winds, the currents, and all of the other factors that would have been involved. And they worked out that if you stop over in the Maldives, you increase your chances of making it to Madagascar significantly. So it's almost very likely that they would have done that. Athol Anderson at ANU, now emeritus, he did a fantastic project looking at some of the Indian Ocean islands to find if there's any archaeological evidence of any stopovers. So he went to places like the Cocos Keeling Islands, I think the Seychelles as well. Basically, they found no evidence of any archaeology anywhere. So the Maldives, which do have archaeology going back at least 2,000 years, seem to be a very strong contender. But yeah, the southern route in every respect makes sense. And I think in terms of the maritime capability, it would have been well within the technology that existed then.
Thank you. It doesn't look as though we've got any other questions coming in. Are there any other of the members of the panel who'd like to ask anything? If not, Alison, you've given us a very, very rich lecture. Thank you very much indeed. And if we can express our thanks in a sort of metaphorical clapping as that you would get if you were in the room, that's the way to express our thanks to you. We wish you the very best for the developing of this research, which is clearly fantastically important. I'm getting a message saying there are about 20 people on YouTube as well as those on Zoom here, and we've been fortunate that these lectures then have an afterlife, which is the advantage of this technology. So thank you again, and I give notice that the next meeting will be on Thursday the 20th of October, 5 p.m. at Burlington House, when we will hear a paper, Landscapes of Defence in Early Medieval England by Dr. Stuart Brooks, FSA. The meeting stands adjourned. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.